Hello, thank you for coming. We're excited to have you here today. Sorry we're a minute late. That was my problem. So we'll be all set here. So come on in and get comfortable. This is we're going to talk to you about. We've got 3 different speakers today. And we're going to talk to you about garlic again and what you do this time of the season so that you can do the best you can at harvesting some beautiful garlic. And we're going to talk to you about cucumbers and corn and some of the tricks about growing those things, and because they're both super delicious. And then we're going to hopefully solve some of your pest issues. We have Kathleen Fitzgerald-Orr, who's going to be speaking to us on pests in your garden this time of year and what you can do to keep them at bay. So, and I know we still have people coming in, so I'm just going to go on and there's some fabulous garlic. This one was at my harvest one year. Hopefully my harvest is this great this coming year. Didn't have quite as wet of a winter though. So just want to remind you that your audio and video will be off because this is a webinar. So you won't be able to ask questions except for in the Q&A for the questions and answers. And we are going through, and this Zoom talk is being recorded. Just want to let you know, in case you have didn't know this already, is that you know, we didn't get very much water this year, not very much rain. So we have lots of good resources for you. On how to save water, how to garden with less water, how to find water in your water budget on our website. So here's what you do. This is what our website looks like. And if you go up here to the food gardening drop-down menu, it's right there, food gardening with less water. And we have lots of great resources for you. So there is also seasonal information that we add on each time we do Veggie Happenings so that you can get to it quickly. So if you have a QR code reader, then go ahead and take a picture of this, or then you'll be able to get right to it. All right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sustainable gardening, just like we do every time. We always, with everything that we do, we're trying to remember that we're growing this food so that it provides us nutrients, and that we love it, and we're protecting the soil. We don't want to add synthetic fertilizers or herbicides or pesticides, because that really defeats the purpose, right, of us growing our own food. We could go to the grocery store and pick up food that probably has used fertilizers and pesticides. So we also try to do minimum soil disturbance to keep that soil growing underneath the ground and all the mycorrhizal network, keeping it going and working for us. And it will also, if you treat the soil right, it's going to do things like use your water more efficiently. We try to plant flowers that benefit plants and beneficial insects. We use compost and organic amendments. It works great. And right plant, right place, right time. Unless you want to work super hard, try to plant the right things in areas that they will be happy in. You'll have to work a lot less. Okay, so we're going to start off with Janet, and Janet is going to talk to us about growing garlic. And if you were here before in the fall, she taught about growing garlic, and now it's this time at the end of the season. So, okay, Janet.
Thank you so much, Toby, for that great introduction, and welcome everybody. And especially welcome to garlic lovers, because it's really an exciting time of the year in the garden. We're getting ready to harvest hopefully in a few weeks. And I want to talk to you about what we need to do leading up to that and the harvest. But first, we're going to do a quick recap of the October meeting we did way back in 2020. Remember that? So if Toby, if you would please give me the next slide. Thank you. And I'm going to do a brief recap about our preparation leading up to planting garlic, which was in the autumn and winter. So next slide, please. So we did talk about I just want to cover some of the main points about garlic. Garlic grows really well in Sonoma County. It's pretty easy to grow. It's best planted in the fall. As we can see, late October, November is a really, really optimal time. But I know somebody who just planted their garlic in January. I couldn't believe it. And we're going to see how that does. Garlic prefers cooler weather. It doesn't do really great as it's maturing in like really hot weather. So it's better in the fall to plant in the fall. It's a long maturing crop. So when you plant it, be sure and reserve space for as much time as up to 7 to 8 months. And we're going to be harvesting, as I said, soon, spring to midsummer. Next slide, please. So we did talk in part 1 about the different types of garlic. And I just wanted to show you this slide to kind of refresh our memories, or if you weren't there, we have soft neck and hard neck are the 2 main types. And their characteristics, as you can see, are a little different. Soft neck tends to store longer. It tolerates a little bit warmer climates as a rule. Hard neck, a lot of people in cold climates will plant them, but they do well here as well. They have that wonderful scape that comes up in the middle. It's a big stalk, which makes flowers, and people love to chop the scape up and use it in cooking. And then there's elephant garlic. I just put here because people ask me about it. It's a type of leek, but very similar to garlic. We probably have all seen those very big cloves. Okay, next slide, please. And we also talked in part 1 about the care over the winter. And as you can see here on the right, a picture of my Italian red garlic, which is a hard neck. And I've mulched the ground around it with straw. I used rice straw, but you can use the mulch of your choice. So you want to prevent compaction of the soil by mulching, and I weeded it. So you want to keep it well weeded. We wanted to make sure there was consistent water, and I do have it on drip, which is the optimal way to water because it gets right to the root zone, doesn't waste water. And I composted the early growth. So I very gently reached around and put a little compost in as the growth appeared in February. So that's our brief recap. We're going to now move to part 2, which is maintenance, care, and harvest. And is it time yet? Hey, are we there yet? Well, we're getting there. So it's an art discovering exactly when you're going to harvest your garlic. You have to know your variety. Different varieties take different amounts of time, of course. So that's good to know your variety. But one way is observation. And as gardeners, we all know that's a really important characteristic in a gardener. So observe your leaves. That is a really key. As you can see here in the picture, the bottom leaves are starting to turn yellowish brown. And when about maybe half to 3/4 of your crop starts to do that, you can be sure that it's and it is at least late spring or into summer, you can be pretty sure that it's going to be time to harvest your garlic. But you also maybe want to check the bulb size so you can, scoot the soil aside a little bit and see if it's the size, that you kind of think it should be. If it's not, you can move the soil back around and let it cook in the soil a little longer, so to speak. But once you decide when your irrigation is, you want to withhold irrigation, once you decide when your harvest is that it's now going to happen, you want to withhold your irrigation for about 1 week. just to let that soil dry out, and it'll be easier to harvest the bulb and you won't get any mold. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So here we go, harvesting garlic. Oh boy. So gently loosen and lift the bulb with a fork or a trowel. You want to brush the soil from the roots and never, ever, ever wash the garlic. The idea is to keep it dry so it doesn't mold. So you will want to use a little soft brush, perhaps. Keep out a little bit of it for your use in the kitchen, because most of your garlic you're going to want, if you have a good amount, you're going to want to dry it or cure it or dry it. That means basically drying it for long storage. So you want to leave most of the paper skins and the roots intact, as you see here, but you can brush the dirt off. And if you're going to braid, it's good to braid them while the stems are still pliable. So let's go to the next slide, please. And here's a wonderful picture of, you saw Toby's garlic. Well, this is Denise's garlic. These two gals are really good garlic growers, I tell you. This is Denise DeRose. She's going to be speaking later, and this is her wonderful harvest. She's laid them out on screens, I believe, to let them be well ventilated to dry. So you want to lay them flat. Some people hang them in a dry, dark room, like a shed, and they even put paper bags over them to keep the dust off. Once the roots are dry and bristly, you know that they're ready. Let's see, store them at room temperature once your bulbs are cured. And paper bags or breathable baskets work really well, wire basket. And never refrigerate them. They'll get moldy. And use within several months, depending on your storage time. Now, as I've said, timing is everything. Everybody says that, but hey, with garlic, don't fret because it is an art. And I just say, you know what? Have fun practicing that art. It's about observation and knowing your varieties and just knowing the weather, climate, what was going on at that time. So here are a few questions people often ask me. What if I harvest too early? What if I harvest too late? Don't worry, you can use the green garlic if it's too early. It's delicious. Even if it doesn't have a bulb, you can chop it up and put it in a dish, in an omelet or a soup or stew. If it's too late, it's still edible. It may taste a little funky if it's been out in the sun a long time, but just use it right away. And if your plant goes to flower, sometimes I forget them in the garden, no worries. Those little flowers are edible and they're very pretty. The bees love them. And you can also plant from the flowers. They make little bulbils, little seeds. But I always recommend actually getting the cloves, just as an aside. The seed cloves or the planting cloves that you buy at your local nursery. And again, what is green garlic? It's just immature garlic before the bulb develops. And the leaves are like shallots. They're very delicious. So no worries, just enjoy practicing and getting that timing right every time you grow garlic. And then we have one final slide with some articles that I really found informative and enjoyable. The first one is at the website Toby showed you under, I believe it's under vegetable articles, and it's on garlic. And then there are some other master gardeners in Santa Clara that I use their articles as well as a reference because they're similar climate. And then I highly recommend Growing Great Garlic by Robert Couric, who talks about the great garlic guru, Chester Aaron, who lived in Sonoma County. And he was a very colorful figure and really knew his garlic. And then my last article is not so much a science-based one, but it's a really fun, informative gardenbetty.com. I really enjoyed her pictures and information on growing and curing garlic. So I think we'll have some questions time for questions at the end, right, Toby?
That's right.
Thank you all for your time and really enjoy your garlic. Make great pesto. Enjoy the summer. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Janet. That's awesome. And it is an art there at the end. And like she said, don't fret if it doesn't go just right. You don't have to take it all out at once either. You can take a few out at once at a time. Okay, so now, and if we weren't hungry enough, now we have Denise DeRose, who is a fabulous cook as well. And she's going to talk to us about cucumbers and corn.
Hey, hi. This is a picture of my kitchen counter, and I include it in here because if you guys start growing cucumbers and corn and have a big lush garden, your relatives and friends are going to be hit every other day with this is my harvest today picture. So I'm just giving you fair warning that that's going to happen. Next slide. Okay, we're going to talk first about cucumbers. They've been around for a long time. We think they were started being cultivated in India, but they're mentioned everywhere in ancient literature. You hear about them in the Bible. The Romans loved them. Both raw and pickled cucumbers are mentioned in their literature. George Washington was a fan, and Queen Elizabeth was a fan, but Samuel Johnson, not so much. Next slide, please. There are many varieties to choose from, and this is not a complete list, but kind of some of the main categories. First, pickling cucumbers. Not all cucumbers make great pickles. So we have developed pickling cucumbers, which have slightly lower water content, and they're a thick skin, usually small, fits in a jar, and they have a taste that pairs well with the vinegar taste of pickling. Slicing cucumbers are meant to go in your salads, go in your sandwiches. They have smooth skin, they have small edible seeds and a crisp texture. And my favorite, I just have to give a shout out for Diva cucumbers. They grow great in Sonoma County, and it's a wonderful plant. Now, I have never had indigestion from cucumbers, but apparently other people have. And it is, if you're subject to indigestion from cucumbers, it comes from a chemical compound called cucurbitacin, which is in the skin of cucumbers. And it has been bred down so that there are lesser concentrations of this in certain varieties, which we call as in a general category burpless. And here are a few of them named. Now, cucumbers normally, they take up your whole yard. They grow enormous, spread everywhere, but we have developed some dwarf cucumbers. If you have small space, the plants are 1 foot by 2 feet. You can find dwarf cucumbers, bush cucumbers, either in pickling or slicing cucumbers. And here's the name of a few of them. Next slide. Another kitchen counter picture with recipes for what the heck are you going to do with all these cucumbers. If you look at this picture, the cucumber on the left, the green one is a slicing cucumber, and then the little round ones are lemon cucumbers. The short ones on the top are pickling cucumbers, and the big mother cucumbers on the bottom are a Vietnamese variety that we tried one year, and I swear to God, each cucumber would feed a family of 4 for a week. So that was the last time we grew that cucumber. Next slide. So tips for how do you grow them? You want to plant the seeds in hills or rows. I usually use hills so that the vines kind of tumble down. In a sunny spot, it's warm enough to plant them now. Plant them 8 to 12 inches apart and mark where the stem is. I say that because when your vines spread out and you go to water your plants, you're not going to know where the roots are. So if you mark the stem, you can water them in that spot and not risk getting your other leaves wet, which makes them more prone to disease. Unless you're planting bush cucumbers, the dwarf cucumbers, you want to provide a sturdy trellis. It saves space, and when the cucumbers go up on the trellis, they're less subject to disease from the earth, and it just saves a lot of room in your garden. You want to mulch around the base of the plant, both to conserve water and to limit the disease and the weeds that they would otherwise be subject to. Cucumbers do need some dressing when the plants flower. So you want to use side dress with compost or fertilizer when the plants flower. And then they need 1 to 2 inches of water a week, which is a little more than other things in your garden will require. Soaker hose is best, drip irrigation is best, so that you conserve water and get right directly to the roots. Now my grandpa, my Italian grandfather DeRose, told me that cucumbers got bitter when you stepped on the stems. And I don't know if that's the case, but any form of stress to the plant can cause bitterness. The most common is when you're not watering them regularly. Let's go to the next slide. A picture from my garden with trellising cucumbers and squash plants here. I say here to pick constantly. And the reason why I bring that forth is because if you let cucumbers go past their maturity, if you let them get overgrown and past their ripeness, it has an impact on the vine. And the production of the vine will slow down if you don't pick constantly. So just a tip. Next slide. Oh, corn. What to say about corn? Next slide. Is there anything better than a freshly picked, juicy ear of corn from your own garden running with butter? You all know the answer to that. It's no. You need to plant these things. Go, next slide. We made corn. We made corn out of grass. On the right here is a picture of the ancestor of corn. It's called teosinte. It's a grass that grew in Mesoamerica. And you can sort of see the familiar markings of corn, the tassels, the male tassels. And this is an ear of the ancestor of corn. It had 5 to 12 kernels, and they had hard shells. These were bred for generations in Central and South America, as many as 10,000 years ago. And now we have ears of corn that have 500 kernels on them. This is where they started out. And in Peru, particularly, they developed the ancestors of our popcorn, dent corn, flour corn, and flint corn, which is known collectively as field corn, which are the non-sweet corns. Next slide. This field corn was carried into North America by the Native Americans and grown there. And sweet corn that we know and love so much today is a spontaneous mutation of field corn, which we developed into all different kinds of sweet corn varieties. Next slide. So to grow great corn, now's the time to plant it. You have a little more time to plant it. You want to grow it in a block. You don't want to grow it in rows. And that is because it is wind pollinated and the plants need to be close to each other so they can pollinate each other. The perfect soil is 6 to 6.8 pH, and you need good draining. You're going to direct seed. You don't need to, you can put the corn kernels in the ground. You don't need to pre-start them. 2 to 4 kernels per mound, about 12 inches between your mounds. When they come up, they get to be 3 or 4 inches high. You can fill in the gaps when if some corn fails to come up, transplant others to fill in the gaps to make to fill out your crop. It does need fertilizer. It needs nitrogen fertilizer when it's planted, when it's 1.5 feet high, and when it grows tassels. And nitrogen fertilizer is any fertilizer where the three, they have the 3 numbers. The first one is nitrogen. And so any fertilizer where the first number is equal to or higher than the other 2 numbers is good for corn. And you want to water thoroughly and frequently and weed it to keep the weeds out. Next slide. Protecting against corn overload. We have these problems, don't we? I had cucumber overload, you have corn overload. If you do not stagger the planting of your corn, it's all going to be ripe at the same time. Next slide. So you want to plant a couple of rows of corn in week 1, and then another couple in week 3, and another couple in week 5. And you do this so that you have a consistent supply of corn throughout your summer. When is it ripe? It's ripe when the silks turn brown and dry out, dark brown and dry out, and the kernels swell. It's easy to let corn get overripe, so you want to check it. Cut a slit in the husk, puncture a kernel. If the liquid is clear, it's not ready. If it's white, solid white, it's overripe and it's going to be starchy tasting. If it's milky but still translucent, it's ripe. Okay, next slide.
Denise, you have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so since we're talking about cucumbers and corn, we need to talk about cross-pollination. Next slide. Angiosperm pollination, flowering plants pollination. Pollination happens with the transfer of pollen grains from the anthem to the stigma of a flower. Self-pollinating plants like peppers and tomatoes, this transfer will happen within the same flower or within 2 flowers on the same plant. Other plants require cross-pollination, where it is the transfer of pollen from the anther in one plant to the stigma of a flower on another plant, or transfer of pollen from the anther in one plant to the stigma of the flower in another plant. It can be the same or a different variety. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. So if you've got, can you cross-pollinate? Can you have a Canto zucchini? And the answer to that is no, because different varieties of the same species can cross-pollinate, but one species cannot cross-pollinate with a different species. But that still causes us problems in the garden. So you can have cross-pollination between varieties of the same species. If you've seen this cucumber in your garden, like I have, that has happened. It does not normally affect this year's crop. It affects the seeds in this year's crop, so that when you grow next year from those seeds, it's going to have the characteristic of both varieties. So for example, if you plant Indian corn next to your sweet corn, no, I'm sorry, let me take that back. It affects the seeds only, and so we only have to worry about the fruit being affected in 2 categories, sweet corn and English hothouse cucumbers. Excuse my lack of clarity there. Let's go on to the next slide. I'll clean it up. So there are 2 circumstances where cross-pollination will affect this year's crop, and that is with sweet corn and with English hothouse cucumbers. So with sweet corn, if you grow 2 types of corn near each other, they will cross-pollinate, and the taste and color and texture of this year's corn will be affected by the presence of the other corn variety nearby. So this is, if you plant Indian corn near your sweet corn, they're going to cross-pollinate, and this year's crop will be a mixture of those 2, the characteristics of those 2 plants. Won't be as sweet, will be funny looking. The other exception, where this year's crop is affected, is with English or hothouse cucumbers, or generally any kind of a totally seedless cucumber. And that is because a seedless cucumber is called a parthenogenic cucumber, which means that it produces fruit without being fertilized. That's why you don't get seeds. So if you have a seedless cucumber that is pollinated by a normal cucumber nearby, it's going to produce this year the bumpy and irregular fruit with the seeds. Okay, next slide.
Denise,
So how do you prevent cross-pollination? A couple of ways to do it. With a greenhouse or floating row cover, which works if you're growing hothouse cucumbers, doesn't work, not very practical with corn because it's so big and so tall by the time that the pollen is an issue. So one way to do it is to grow varieties with a different date to maturity and flowering time. So if you're looking at corn, for example, and you pick one that has 60 days to maturity and pick another that has 100 days to maturity and plant them closer to each other, chances are you're not going to get cross-pollination. And the other way to do it is to isolate by distance. Plant your blocks of corn 300 feet apart, although I have to say I've seen research that says 100 feet is enough, and I've seen research that says 800 feet is not enough. So there's conflict on that. And cucumbers, if you want to grow hothouse cucumbers and you don't want to cover them, you're going to have to ask your neighbor. So it's going to, because they have to be apart by quite a distance. Okay. These are some of the sources. You can check them out online when we publish this.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. Awesome. Okay, and now we have Kathleen Fitzgerald-Orr, and she's going to help us with our garden pest issues right now, because I'm sure you've started to see some of these problems. Take it away, Kathleen.
Thank you, Toby, and welcome once again to all our viewers. My short talk is going to be mostly about spring garden pests and with a focus on aphids and cucumber beetles. Next slide, please. So what to do, how to make this feasible? Properly dispose of plant residues from previous year's garden and plant varieties that are recommended for use in your area and plant them at the proper time for the best growth. Planting too early when the soil is cool may make the plants more susceptible to some soil insects. Going to the picture on the top right, this is a picture of a fruit mummy, and pests are looking for safe places to overwinter and also to lay eggs, and the mummies are perfect shelter for them. Also, fungi and bacteria remain in these mummies, either in a dormant or active state. So remember, right plant for the right place, right time. That's one of the master gardener mantras. Next slide, please. Inspect your plants before purchase to make sure they're healthy, not infested with insects, or not root bound. It's a little difficult sometimes lifting a plant out of the transplant container, but do the best you can. Make sure there's no roots that are escaping out of the bottom. Use proper plant spacings, fertilizers, water, and cultural practices to ensure vigorous plant growth. Plants that are growing vigorously often can tolerate more insect damage than poorly growing plants. Next slide, please. Keep your garden as weed-free as possible. This year, that seems like a huge undertaking. I think everyone I've talked to is just dealing with a plethora of weeds this year. Keeping the weeds down helps the plants to continue to grow vigorously because weeds harbor insects that will attack the vegetables. Also consider the presence of companion plants. These plants may increase the natural enemy population. We'll talk a little more about that later. Next slide, please. Inspect your plants regularly for insects or insect damage. Early detection means more control, more effective control, and can reduce the amount of damage that is suffered. Especially in areas that are small gardens, early detected caterpillars, loopers, hornworms, and large beetles can often be handpicked from plants and destroyed before they cause problems. My kids used to go out and pick a lot of these critters and throw them over the fence to the chickens and ducks next door. Next slide, thank you. So there's different garden pest management techniques. A lot of them are just using things that we have around and inspecting our plants very carefully. In the top left, a sort of silly photo, but cats have excellent night vision. But we humans might want to put on a night vision headlamp when looking for insect pests after dark. And believe me, that's a good time to go looking. Use insecticidal soap. And on the top right, this is a blown up picture of a soft-bodied aphid. And those markings are called spiracles, and they're circular openings that are used for breathing. So if you happen to spray them with the soap, it clogs up the breathing tubes and suffocates the insect. I know it sounds gruesome, but sounds good to me. We are in a drought, obviously. So keep as much water within your home as possible. Never let water go down the drain. Use it to water your indoor plants or your garden, as well as using it to fill a spray bottle with insecticidal soap. And when you do use that, you want to spray both the upper and the lower parts of a leaf to reach all insects. Next slide, please. We have a great poster available on UCIPM, and it has to do with meeting the beneficials. These are the natural enemies of garden pets. You really want to familiarize yourself with the different stages in a certain insect's life, such as the lady beetle. The larva stage looks like a little mini alligator. And at one point I caught my son feeding them to his carnivorous plants. Obviously you want to be more aware. These predators hunt, attack, and kill their prey. So encourage them by avoiding pesticides that will kill them. Choose plants that provide them pollen, nectar, and shelter. And try to keep ants out of pest-infested plants. Common predators that eat garden pests are again in this poster that you can actually download online. Next slide, please. Provide for the vegetable plant's basic needs. Adequate light, at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight a day, well-drained soil, water. Drip irrigation is probably the easiest and most efficient, and plant materials available at the planting site. So think compost and the season prior cover crops. Next slide, please. Aphids are common in your garden. Is that a surprise? I don't think so. Aphids like lush new growth. Don't over-fertilize. Use organic or slow release products. Aphids also build up on flowering plums, roses, tulip trees, and you can see there, that's a picture from my front yard, Liriodendron, that gets coated in aphids and honeydew, and it's just a mess. Crepe maples, apples, and many vegetables. So just expect them when you grow these plants. Next slide, please. Consider the use of row covers to physically protect plants from insects. Used early in the season, they provide some protection from the frost. For vegetables that require pollinators, those row covers will need to be taken off when flowers are present. Next slide, please. And why rotate crops? Well, each plant family has certain soil-borne diseases and pests that are specific to that plant family. By continuously changing plant family in a given location, you make it harder for those family-specific diseases and pests to become well established. Rotating your crops keeps your soil healthier and will give you better crops. Next slide, please. Aphids, so sort of fine-tuning these little critters. They are semi-social, sucking pests of many flowers, shrubs, and trees. They drain plants of their nutrients and prevent beneficial insects from using these plants as a food source. They're also used by ants, including fire ants, in a symbiotic relationship. And you can see at the bottom difference. And aphids come in all colors, depending on the plant that they're feeding on. And on the lower right, there's a green peach aphid giving birth to live young. Lovely. Next slide, please. So about that relationship between the aphids and ants. Ants and aphids share a very well-documented symbiotic relationship, which means they both benefit mutually from the working relationship. Aphids produce a sugary food for the ants, and in exchange, the ants care for and protect the aphids from predators and parasites. Next slide, please. Some symptoms of aphid activity is, if we don't already know them, there's in the top left, sooty mold growing on honeydew produced by an aphid. Top right, leaf curling caused by another aphid. And down below, you see the interaction between the aphids and Argentine ants, which are farming them or livestocking them, as some literature calls. Next slide, please. What are some of the best methods of aphid control? Well, first of all, frequent inspection. Best times to go out are early in the morning when insects are moving a little slow, and then of course at night. Don't over fertilize. Use pelletized or slow release fertilizers to help avoid problems of being over fertilized. Spray with water. And of course, this is going to become a bigger problem as we move into the drought. But by using the jet or shower spray on a dial nozzle, it's enough to dislodge these pests, knocks them off the plant, and they often cannot climb back onto the plant and then will starve to death. Be thinking about beneficial predators. Pictures on both the lower left and right. On the lower left, it's the lady beetle larva going after the aphids, and on the lower right, it is yet another beneficial, the lacewing larva going after the aphids. Next slide, please.
Kathleen, you're at 2 minutes.
Cucumber beetles, as if we haven't seen enough of them in our gardens this year. The one thing I want to mention is be sure to know the difference between a cucumber beetle and one of our wonderful natural predators, the ladybug beetle, and be aware of the different stages. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of cucumber beetle damage: chewing on leaves, bacterial wilt, and cucumber mosaic virus. Next slide, please. Some control measures: rotate the crops, use rotating flow covers, apply straw mulch, intercropping, transplant rather than direct seed to give these little guys a head start, and also consider getting up early in the morning and using your battery operated hand vacuum. One of my good buddies from the IPM team goes out and uses this every morning on her CSA crops. Next slide, please. Insectary plants. These are grown to attract, feed, and shelter insect parasites and predators to enhance biologic pest control. These plants provide nectar and pollen, which the adults of many natural enemy species need to consume. Next slide, please. Natural enemies. These are the predators, parasites, pathogens that reduce pest populations and help prevent damage to the plants. Next slide, please. And just some of the resources that I used in this presentation today, and these will be available once it's posted. We have so much information on UCIPM, also on our own Master Gardener website here in Sonoma County. And thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to give you a second before I take this share off if you want to capture this code, and then you can get all those resources. We also have other resources, and these talks are on YouTube, the Sonoma County Master Gardener site. You know, I found that it's easier for me to just Google Veggie Happenings YouTube and put the month in, and it'll come right up so that you can go back and get some of this information as well. Kathleen is a UCIPM specialist in addition to everything else that she does. And so that's the pest information at the bottom is really fabulous. Okay, So now I'm going to go through, I have to show you one last slide. There's a sunflower from a previous year, which I just love sunflowers. Okay, so now let's see. Let's see some questions. Okay, so, all right. Okay, what suggestions do you have for preventing rust for next year? My garlic is grown in raised beds, and this is the second year that I have had rust. Last year, there was no problem with taste or bulb development. This year, I harvested 2 beds over the weekend. Most bulbs did not properly develop. I have lots of green garlic. So Janet, would you unmute and answer that question?
I'm going to start by answering it and then defer to Kathleen or others about the rust. But I did find a great article on the IPM, UC IPM. So just Google that. And I couldn't paste it in time, but if you Google rust on onions and garlic, and basically what I know is the rust overwinters often on crops that have remained. As Kathleen was saying, I believe she talked about this, but you want to weed out stuff because it's going to overwinter. So we weed things, weed your garlic bed really well. And rotation is really important as well. And if you don't have a lot of land, there are ways to rotate. I won't go into it now, but you can plant in different pots even, or divide your beds in half or in thirds and try it that way, where you move 2 to 3 years is a good thing to avoid the rust. Rust apparently, and Kathleen, correct me on this or anyone else, apparently likes cool weather, cooler conditions. So again, it is overwintering. And the early varieties of California garlic tend to exhibit resistance, although apparently I don't know of any that are totally resistant yet. Maybe someone else does. So if you find a early garlic, try that. And I think that's all I have on rust and garlic.
Okay, we have somebody that's raised their hand. Let me see if we can unmute them. Let's see. All right, let's see if I can do that. I haven't done that before. No, I raised my own hand. I'm going to let Tommy work on that. So we had a raised hand. And they might have had something to share on the garlic. So I have another garlic question for you, Janet. How do you get rid of dirt? This person says, mine doesn't seem to brush off. After a few months, the garlic seems super peppery. Anything to prevent this?
Well, about the brushing off, are you stopping irrigation a few days before you harvest? Because that will dry your bulb out and the soil around it out. And then making sure your garlic is really dry, that you and cured. I'm not sure about the pepperiness. So but those are the 2 things I do to get the dirt off, because I found when I haven't waited, it gets moldy. And you can carefully peel that outer skin off, but you want to leave something on, the skin on, because it protects the garlic and the flavor. So maybe somebody else who's grown garlic has more about the pepperiness or keeping the soil off.
I haven't had issues with the pepperiness. I did have, when I try to rush it, last year I tried to rush it and I didn't cut the water for a long enough period of time. And my soil, it's pretty good, but it tended to stay on there and it was wet enough. So mine even went through and I did put it in the shade. I bundled it up. But because it was wet when I pulled it out and the soil was still wet, then I had it actually still keep growing. And so I learned my lesson this year. I think that for this year, I'm going to go through, cut the garlic for at least a week, or cut the water, and then pull up some and make sure that it's pretty dry. And mine is in a raised bed, so I don't think that will be an issue. So let's see, the guest with the hand raised is, okay. So hold on one second. I have, okay, trying to pull up, sorry, I have a chat also, and which I couldn't read quickly enough. Okay, okay, here you go, Denise. Here's a question for you. I love Midori cucumbers, but they're difficult to grow in Sebastopol. Denise lives in Sebastopol, and I only have 2 seeds left from last year. Do you know of a local source for this variety?
I saw your question in the Q&As, and I've been looking since then to find them. And everybody online seems to agree with you that they are wonderful cucumbers. And I haven't found any source online for their seeds, so I'm sorry. I don't know, but sounds, Toby, next year when we are growing at the garden for our sale, maybe that would be something we should look into.
That's exactly right. Exactly. And you know, one thing I wanted to add too, when Denise was talking about the cucumbers and, you know, marking the stems and that, which was really a super great idea. The other thing is when I first started planting cucumbers, I planted 1 lemon cucumber, 1 pickling cucumber, and 1 Armenian cucumber. Don't do that. I mean, you know, plant more of them because, you know, you will have cucumbers that don't make it. And as far as pollination goes, you want to make sure that, you know, you've got a lot of blossoms there. Okay, so the guest that that had the hand raised, you now it's Anne Marie. Anne Marie, you can go ahead and talk. Can unmute yourself? Do you have anything to add about the garlic?
Actually, are you hearing me?
Yes.
My question was that I planted in a raised bed hollyhocks last year, not realizing they wouldn't necessarily bloom the first year. Well, they got rust this year when they came back up.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if I am safe to pull them out and replant that bed with tomatoes.
Good question. I know that I have hollyhocks and they do get rust very easily. Anybody have anything to add on that? Kathleen, that sounds like a Kathleen question. So the question is you would like to pull out the hollyhocks and then go ahead and plant tomatoes, but the hollyhocks had rust. I think I mean, if I were you, I would go ahead and try it. I mean, and see. I think it should be fine. You may, if it was a huge issue, you may want to take a little bit more of the soil around where the hollyhocks were. But yes, you know, those hollyhocks are wonderful. I have to say, you need to leave them. They will flower the second year. And then don't cut them all the way off if you want them back there because they will come back each year. Okay, so Midori.
Toby, can I say something quickly? I noticed Nancy, did you notice Nancy's crippling?
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know if you were going to address that, but she says that she recommended in Santa Clara holding off on water on the garlic about the soil issue. On the roots, holding off on water at Mother's Day and harvesting at Father's Day. So that was in Santa Clara. They did 1 month without irrigation. That's interesting, especially if you have clay soil. I would imagine that, like I do, that would probably work for me really well. But
that's great.
And
Nancy is a food gardening specialist, master gardener as well. So thank you, Nancy, for chiming in there. Let's see. All right, so that was Anne Marie's question. How much distance do you have to allow to rotate? 8 feet away in a raised bed. Oh, okay, so how about Denise? Talking about rotating crops. And the question was.
Yeah, so if you're in the same bed, is that what I'm understanding? You're trying to.
I think that there are 2 things that maybe are getting confused. One is the pollination and then the rotating the crops in the beds. So.
Okay, so when we're talking about pollination, that's different for many varieties of plants. We talked about corn, we talked about cucumbers. With crop rotation, what you're worried about is what residual is in the soil from this year's crop that may impact next year's crop. and it's more likely to impact the same kind of crop. So if you're planting nightshades, if you're planting tomatoes and you got late blight with your tomatoes, should you plant peppers in that bed next year, which is also a nightshade? And the answer is no. If you can help it, you know, I mean, we would all like to have acres of farm, I guess, but if you have a small garden and you can't rotate, then the best thing you can do is provide for healthy plants, like give them enough airspace between the plants. You know, try not to stress them out. Mulch and keep the leaves up off the ground so that you don't transmit diseases from the soil. And I'm not exactly sure I understand 8 feet away. I'm not sure that I understand what the question is. Do you understand, Toby?
Well, and you know, I think too, maybe it's with square foot gardening. And, you know, I know that when you do square foot gardening, you go through and you have, you know, multiple things in the same bed. And most of us intercrop anyway. But so maybe it's that you have a tomato at this far end of the bed and, you know, how far away can it be before you plant the tomato here? So.
Yeah. So I would say that you know, person asking this question obviously has limited space to deal with. And I think the answer is plant as far away from that spot. If your tomato had late blight, plant at the other end of the bed, you know, and do what you can to space it out.
Yeah, the recommendation from UCIPM is backyard gardeners with limited space should at least avoid planting exactly the same crop or any crop from the same family year after year in the same part of the garden. So rotate, just like Denise said, rotate as much as possible. And hopefully that will help.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that too, you know, a lot of us add like 2 inches or so of compost on the top at the end of the season, or adding compost as you go. Sometimes we add more soil in. I think all those things do tend to help. And then growing other things in between also does tend to help. Okay, so Denise, here's one for you. Not that you probably have thought about this. Nancy Creveling says, I saw a restaurant using wine corks as a mulch in their beds. Any issues with doing this? She'd love to do this in her blueberry wine barrel. How fun is that? So what do you think?
I think it sounds like a great idea, particularly having to drink all that wine to get your mulch.
I agree. Maybe we should have somebody research that. I think that's a great idea. I mean, sounds like, you know, it would definitely help with losing water. So here's a good question. And Kathleen, I bet this is more for you. It says, are there any types of household gray water that should not be used in the garden? And I'm sure that they are talking about vegetable garden.
The only type of gray water that would be usable would be oh my goodness. Oh, now I'm sorry. I'm having a.
I know what you're talking about. You're talking about, yes, water from ourselves. So. Yeah.
So like a Castile soap. Oh, I'm sorry, biodegradable. Oh my God, my brain just went to sleep.
Oh, okay.
You know, if you're using a biodegradable soap, then that's it's feasible, but I think you'd want to dilute it. It must be biodegradable.
And you know, the other thing too, there is an article on the page that I had showed you at the beginning, as far as, you know, watering in a drought. And one of the articles had spoken to the fact of doing the catchment off of your roofs, and they don't recommend that as far as using on your vegetables. So
right, definitely not, because of all of the other solutes
unless what about a metal roof though? I guess metal roofs, I have them on my shed. Do they say anything about that? Because I tend to hose them. Maybe I shouldn't be hosing them off, but the first time around, they're very dusty. So I'm wondering if people have metal roofs.
That's a good question. That's something that we'll have to look up. Yeah, so, okay, let's see. All right, we have raised bed. Okay, here's another question. We have a raised bed about 12 feet. Can I put a tomato at one end of this year? Okay, and there's the question. And at the other end the next year?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't see why.
No, and I know I grow a lot in that same Solanaceae family. Peppers, potatoes, tomatoes, everything I like is in there. And so, yeah, you do the best that you can to rotate with what you've got. So, and definitely grow what you're going to be able to eat and whatever you have, because we're using that precious water. So make sure you go ahead, and if you have things like extra artichokes, people are starting to, stop me now. No more artichokes, because they're prolific this year and we're not wasting any artichokes. We may eat them every night for, a month, but
Sounds good to me. What about with tomatoes? You might consider the grow bags.
yeah,
So that's another great resource for, if you have limited space, look into using a grow bag for your tomatoes.
that's exactly right. And I have to say that at Harvest for the Hungry Garden, where food gardening specialists, master gardeners have a little demo area, we have got the burlap sacks that we got for free at one of the nurseries in the off season. And we did fill those with soil, and we planted potatoes in them. And there's some issues because potatoes, you keep adding things to, but I did it with garlic and onions this year, and it's worked well. So that would be a good way to rotate. So okay, I think we are at our time, and we have answered most of the questions. So let's see. I think I did. Okay, well, we really totally appreciate you coming. And I want to make sure that people are coming back for next month, because next month we have summer fruit tree pruning, which is really a great time to prune your fruit trees, and gardening with kids. And we're also going to have master food preservers, and they're going to teach you how to, we think, do strawberry fruit leather. So, so lots of great things coming up. So put us on your calendar for the second Tuesday in June. Thank you so much for coming.